This is not going to be a reading as such. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the book came to be with the help of some audiovisual aids. And then I am going to introduce my esteemed friend, Charles Morrisey, who is actually one of my mentors in putting this book together. We're going to just have a little colloquy up here for a while, and then open it out to questions from you. It's a very provocative topic, and scarcely an event goes by without questions of some sort. So, the title, Red Scare in the Green Mountains, the subtitle, Vermont in the McCarthy Era. I have come over the years to much prefer the term Red Scare to the McCarthy era for a few reasons. One is it's got color. It's got a visceral quality. It introduces the concept of fear. And it takes the neutral historical approach to the McCarthy era, like the Pleistocene era or the Mesozoic era or the Depression era. Red Scare really says something. And there is a second reason why I chose that. This is Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. And the other reason why I prefer Red Scare is that if you go back to your historical timeline, the time that Senator McCarthy spent on the national stage was actually very limited. It began in February 1950, lasted till the fall of 1954. And we know that a lot happened before then. In fact, a historian friend of mine said, you could say the Red Scare started with the first Reds, going all the way back to Karl Marx in 1848. Another historian friend said, when I told him what I was working on, he said, oh, you mean the first Red Scare or the second Red Scare? That's when I find out that the period right after World War I in the 1920s was called the first Red Scare. And it was when the American Civil Liberties Union was founded. It was when people like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were being deported. It was when J. Edgar Hoover got his start at the FBI. The McCarthy era, the Red Scare, started before McCarthy, and God knows it lasted after McCarthy. And you still see, we're going to see it next year, how anybody who is going to be running on the Democratic ticket is going to be attacked as a socialist. Anyway, going back, the real inspiration for this book has to be credited to my parents, who were both New York City school teachers through the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. My father lost his job in the McCarthy era, and my mother continued teaching until the late 60s. I quote the novelist Philip Roth in my book. He was eulogizing his former English teacher in Newark, New Jersey, who lost his job in the McCarthy era. And he said that his teacher, like so many others of his generation, including my parents, were impaled on their moment in history. The way I interpret that is my parents, as idealistic young people growing up in the Depression, of Eastern European immigrant parents, attracted to activity on the left, union organizing, joined the Communist Party as rank and file members. And I always have to remind my audiences that the Communist Party in the 1930s was one of many ways that one could get politically active. And they were certainly the most active organization that was organizing against racial injustice for one issue. They were also very, if you wanted to organize a union at your workplace, the Communist Party was often the place to go. So, impaled on their moment in history, they joined organizations, they signed petitions, they marched at certain demonstrations. 15 years later, 20 years later, all of a sudden, they're called in front of an investigating committee. Did you join this organization? Did you go on this demonstration? Did you sign this petition? And who else was there with you? And those are the questions that my mother, for one, refused to answer to the New York State Board of Education investigating committee that was set up. My father had the misfortune to have, as one of his students, somebody who grew up to be a paid informant for the Senate Internal Security Committee and the FBI. His name was Harvey Matuzzo, and he named hundreds and hundreds of people before he recanted, but it was way too late for the people whose lives he ruined. Anyway, as Valdine said in her introduction, I grew up with this, knowing that this era had a very particular effect on my family. And when I got to Vermont, it was just in the back of my mind, I wonder what happened here. I hadn't even heard of Phil Hoff or Ralph Flanders or any of those. I didn't know anything about Vermont history, only that I was supposedly moving to a very, very Republican state. And as I found out, that Republican designation came in many variations. So Valdine referred to the conference that three of us organized. I actually have a conference booklet that I'll be happy to let you look at afterwards. I always felt that the conference, as successful as it was, only skimmed the surface of what there was. And by the time I really started work in earnest on this book, I had a great advantage in that the conference was recorded, both video and cassette, and some of it was transcribed. And so I had a great head start in research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the panels that we had at the conference that became chapters in the book, starting with the role that Vermont played in the downfall of McCarthy in the person of our very Republican, very conservative businessman, senator from Springfield, Vermont, Ralph Flanders. Here's a Associated Press photo of Flanders handing a piece of paper to McCarthy. In the middle there is, anybody? Roy Cohn. And if anybody is curious about what the thread is from then until now, look no further. Roy Cohn was, as a 25-year-old, the protege of Senator McCarthy. As a 50-year-old, he was the mentor to Donald Trump. Say no more. Anyway, so one of the conferences, one of the panels on the conference was about Senator Flanders, and the headlines in the Rutland Herald that were, you could see from April *54 to the fall of '54. This was on the front page of every newspaper in Vermont, mainly the Rutland Herald and its editor and publisher, Robert Mitchell. And Mitchell was one of the guests at our conference, and he said that the editorials that he wrote against McCarthyism and supporting Flanders were some of his proudest moments in the newspaper world. While doing the research for the Flanders panel, going through those awful microfiche machines in the library. I had to go through day by day 1954. And this headline really struck me. Vermont farmer cites Fifth Amendment when questioned on red status. My first thought was, who's this Vermont farmer? Is he still alive? Can we get him to the conference to speak? Well, I found out, once I saw his name, that he was subsequently a lot more well-known than he was for being a Vermont farmer, than for being a China scholar of the first order, is William Hinton, who wrote several classic books on communist China. And so one chapter in the book is about William Hinton and his remarkable family. His mother founded Putney School in southern Vermont. His sister Joan Hinton Engst and William Hinton were two of the few Americans to be actually in China in 1949 when the revolution happened. So another panel at the conference was about the one high-profile academic firing that happened in Vermont during this time. In 1953, Alex Novikov, who was a biochemistry professor at the UVM Medical School, state universities all over the country came under a lot of pressure when professors were named in various investigating committees, especially since the state legislatures had the purse strings. So the governor of Vermont at that time, Lee Emerson, put a lot of pressure on the Vermont legislature and the Board of Trustees at UVM to fire Novikov. They told Novikov that just tell us what you refused to tell the Senate committee, and you can keep your job. That's the explanation of that headline. So Novikov left Vermont and went on to great fame at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. And he lived to see UVM invite him to come back and get an honorary degree and an apology in 1988. One of our guests at the conference was Novikov's major defender on the UVM faculty. His name was Arnold Schein, and my chapter is all about Schein and Novikov, their relationship and how this played out. Henry Wallace, who ran for president on a very left-wing platform in 1948 in the Progressive Party, was mercilessly red-baited by the two Burlington newspapers, the Free Press, which is still around, and the Burlington Daily News, which is not, which was published by William Loeb. One surprise to me was that before going to New Hampshire, William Loeb actually started his career in Vermont. One of our guests at the conference was Paul Sweezy, and he was a Marxist economist who was a part-time New Hampshire resident. And Richard Hathaway, who taught history for many years at Goddard College and Vermont College, who was one of the organizers with me of this conference, he said, we have to have a chapter, a panel at the conference on what happened in Vermont that didn't happen in New Hampshire and vice versa. And Paul Sweezy was threatened with a 5-year jail term for refusing to answer questions by a New Hampshire Attorney General's investigating committee. This did not happen in Vermont. There was no such Attorney General, there was no such committee. But New Hampshire also had William Loeb, who by that time was running the Manchester Union Leader. And God forbid you should cross his path in the wrong way. He would run a front page editorial excoriating you in great detail. So we actually got a letter as we were preparing in this conference. The Vermont Historical Society got a letter from a neighbor of some of you, maybe, John McClowery, who said, "I see that you have invited the notorious Marxist Paul Sweezy to your conference. This will not stand." And Michael Sherman of the Vermont Historical Society had to write a letter saying, "We're not inviting him to talk about Marxism, just about." So, it was alive and well in Vermont for sure. So those were the panels that became the chapters, and very briefly I'll talk about some of the other things that I started to research once I started work on the book in earnest. A very fascinating, complicated story about Owen Lattimore, the Asia scholar, and several other summer residents, mainly in Bethel and Randolph, and too complicated to go into here, but happy to talk about it later. Andrew Newquist Sr., who was a UVM political science professor who was prevailed upon by some liberals in the Republican Party to run against our 5-term congressman at the time, Charles Plumlee. This was in 1946. And you'll see he got, there was a rumor that went around that that Newquist had been endorsed by the Communist Party of Barrie, all 25 members of them. And Newquist was really mounting a great campaign, and all of a sudden had to defend himself against these charges, and he lost. And there's is Bernard O'Shea, who was from Swanton, way up in the northwest corner of Vermont, a crusading newspaper editor, the only outright Democrat who was running a newspaper in Vermont. He wrote many, many editorials, but he was also a player in the Democratic Party, and he was the campaign advisor to William H. Meyer, who became the first Democrat in 104 years to get elected to the U.S. Congress in 1958. And he unfortunately lost for re-election in 1960 largely because of the big presidential election turnout. And hard to believe, looking back on the year 1960, but Vermont went overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon. So one thread between then and now, again, is that William Meyer, when he lost for his re-election campaign, he ran again for Senate, then again for Congress, then again for Senate, each time losing faith in the Democratic Party in Vermont and becoming more and more disenchanted with those kind of electoral politics. Once the National Democratic Party kind of abdicated their responsibility on the Vietnam War, he said, "I'm through." And in 1970, he put out the call for a new party to be formed, the Liberty Union. And one of the people at that original meeting was Bernie Sanders. And this is a photo of Bernie's election night victory that started the whole game in 1981. So that is a very concise wrap-up of what is in the book, which, by the way, will be on sale afterwards, and I'll be happy to sell and sign copies. So now I would like to introduce longtime friend, man about East Hardwick, Charles Morrisey. Charlie had been the executive director of the Vermont Historical Society when I moved to Vermont, so we go back a long ways. So we're going to just chat about the book. Charlie?
I was a close watcher of Rick's evolving book on McCarthyism because we met routinely and often at the Hardwick Village restaurant, locally known as the Diner. and he is a man who likes his pancakes with blueberries. And I was his editor, and I was constantly reading portions of his manuscript, which when you get into the book, you'll see it's 8 episodes. And I'd say, I think you need to amplify here, or you need to not repeat yourself there, or you need to contextualize what you're saying about McCarthy from Wisconsin and his relationship to Vermont. He's a good man to edit, an easy man to edit. He took my suggestions, but I was constantly questioning him. Are you sure you got this date right? Are you sure you got these numbers right? And my major 2 worries were, given his personal closeness to the topic, could he maintain objectivity as a scholar without, in effect, writing a gotcha book representing his parents against Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism? And the answer is yes, he achieved that. And the other thing that concerned me writing the book is, could he unite these 8 separate episodes, varying from Swanton in the northwest corner to Putney in the southeast corner, into a unified, nicely weaved, overarching narrative? I was afraid we're going to get 8 pieces without a unifying narrative. But no, he was able to do that. And this is his first book, so this is quite astounding, and he deserves to be commended for it. Now, since we're meeting tonight in Greensboro, some of you may be prompted to ask if Greensboro ever figured in any way in what we call McCarthyism. And the answer is yes, because Jenny Stoner, who many of you know, in collaboration with Ann Park, wrote an essay for the 2002 issue of the Hazen Road Dispatch, the annual journal of the Greensboro Historical Society. This is the current issue that came out about a month ago. And in this article, titled Stories of Spar Cottage, Jenny Stoner tells how when Jean Spar Fine died in 1935, her oldest daughter, Margaret Spar, inherited this cottage on the west side of Caspian Lake. And Margaret Spar taught constitutional law at Hunter College in New York City. Jenny Stoner recalls her Aunt Margaret as always ready to discuss politics. Then you read this sentence in this 2002 essay about the Spar Cottage, quoting Jenny Stoner here. During the McCarthy era in the 1950s, she had some special friends, a colleague at Hunter and his family, who spent several summers with her because he had been a victim of New York State's equivalent of the House Un-American Activities Committee and had lost his job. It did happen here. So I want to start with questions. I need to also preface this by saying, 1 year ago, yesterday, Rick and I performed at the Galaxy Bookshop in Hardwick with me moderating and asking questions. And we enjoyed that so much, we decided to do a duplicate here tonight. So my first question for you, Rick, is you described Ralph Landers as a hero, but there are 2 villains in your book, both of whom were born in Hardwick, Vermont. One is Brest Orton, and the other was the Vermont's former Governor Lee Emerson. Why are they black hats in your book?
First, I want to say that your mention of the Spar family, this is happening to me all this year, going around talking about the book, as I thought it would. Why didn't I think about writing a chapter about, I'm now up to about 5 or 6 chapters that should have been included in the book. But anyway, Brest Orton, whose name might be familiar to some of you, is the kind of the grandfather of the Vermont Country Store, right? Yeah. He was a very strident conservative who wrote letters to every Vermont paper when William Meyer was running for re-election, saying that accusing Meyer of being an atheist, and that he had gotten out of the army kind of underhandedly. He really attacked Meyer's patriotism and religious beliefs. And people in the Republican Party really had to disown those comments as the election heated up. Lee Emerson, mentioned earlier, was the governor of Vermont when Professor Novikov was facing being fired by the University of Vermont. There's a wonderful book called No Ivory Tower by Barbara Ehrenreich, and it's specifically a study of what happened in academia during this era. And she said there was a pattern. Somebody in academia was called in front of an investigating committee. They refused to name names. Then it went back to the universities that there was, on the part of the local newspapers or the president of the college, or in this case the governor, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to let this professor continue to teach? And it took a very courageous university president, such as Robert Hutchins at University of Chicago, or Harold Taylor at Sarah Lawrence College, to say, we're not going to do anything about it. We hired this person to teach because they know their subject, and politics has nothing to do with it. So sure enough, Novikov testified in May of 1953, came back to Vermont, and there was a demand to have a faculty committee to deal with the question of should he be retained. And that faculty committee voted 5-1 to retain him. I think it was the end of the story. That's where Lee Emerson comes in. And Lee Emerson said to the university president, Robert Boardman, you get a new committee together and make sure this guy gets fired. So that new vote was something like 15-6. And Emerson threatened UVM with cutting their funds in the legislature if they didn't do this.
You mentioned Robert Hutchins. When he was president of the University of Chicago, some critic said to him, you teach communism up there at the university, don't you? And he said, yes, we do, and we teach cancer, and we teach heart disease, and we teach other ailments. A commendable man. Could you elaborate on why you're so high on how the press treated McCarthyism?
Well, in Vermont, what I discovered was that there were many shades of republicanism, as I said. There were people like Robert Mitchell or John Drysdale, Dickey's father, in Randolph, who were kind of New Deal Republicans of the Aiken variety, who were quite liberal for on that continuum. Then there were kind of the middle of the road Eisenhower Republicans, represented like by the Burlington Free Press. And then over on the far right side, there was William Loeb in St. Albans and Burlington, and another person, Milo Reynolds, in Essex Junction. But they were very few. When an issue like Ralph Landers taking on McCarthy hit the headlines, I found that newspapers in Vermont were overwhelmingly in favor of Landers, that they were, go get him, Ralph, you know. And it was only William Loeb who put an editorial on his front page accusing Flanders of being senile. And the headline was, "Wire the old gent." You know, tell him you don't like what he's doing. And so newspaper editors really had a job that was kind of thrust upon them by events. And John Drysdale and Bethel actually played a large part in tamping down the hysteria over this Owen Lattimore episode. He realized it was getting out of hand and prevailed on his friend Robert Mitchell to hire an investigative reporter to get to the bottom of what was happening and run a six episode series with every aspect of this controversy. So I really wound up, after my research, being very impressed with the integrity of these various people.
You said the Bethel situation is complicated, and I certainly acknowledge that. But could you elaborate on some of the tactics the FBI used in Bethel?
The central character in this Bethel controversy was a retired Arctic explorer. It's a funny concept, you know. He was very famous in the teens and earlier. I had never heard of him, but his name was V. Hallmore Stephenson. And he was a part-time resident in Bethel, had been since the early 40s. And he was a friend of Owen Lattimore. He sold Lattimore an adjoining property so that Lattimore could start a Center for Asiatic Studies, is what Lattimore wanted to do. So the FBI was afraid that Lattimore was grooming people to be a figurehead in Mongolia when the Chinese communists took over the government there. They sent FBI agents up there and parked at the foot of Stephenson's driveway to monitor the traffic, and also prevailed on the Bethel postmaster, I don't know, which to steam open the letters and see what letters Lattimore was getting from his friends in Mongolia, and then having to send them elsewhere to be translated. It was very, very broke, and they were totally off base, because what Lattimore was really interested in doing was saving authentic Mongolian culture, because he knew the communists were going to wipe it out. So he was trying to get the Mongolians out of Mongolia. That's briefly.
The chapter 8 in your book is titled, Meanwhile, Across the Connecticut River.
Yes.
What was happening in New Hampshire?
Yeah, well, as I said before, New Hampshire had there actually was a law passed by the New Hampshire, what do they call it, the General Assembly, yeah. Giving the Attorney General investigative powers to call somebody in front and demand they answer questions with the threat of a contempt citation and possible jail time. And the New Hampshire Attorney General was named Lewis Wyman, and he fancied himself a mini McCarthy, as I saw it. And his big hobby horse was leftist influence at the University of New Hampshire. And so he got the legislature to pass this law that if state funds were being used for subversive ends, that they could have an open investigation. And that caught quite a few people up in that dragnet.
The best teacher I had as an undergraduate at Dartmouth College was a creative writing professor named Alexander Lang, who had published very broadly. And Lewis Wyman in New Hampshire went after Alex Lang, who actually lived in Norwich, Vermont, simply because Alex Lang worked in New Hampshire. So if I was Rick writing a book like this, you can see how my personal closeness would be a problem I'd have to solve in order to write a good, scholarly, objective book. Rick, I'm going to go to the contemporary relevance question and read from your preface the following. Today in 2018, in our country finds itself facing new blacklists, fierce attacks on a free press, a revitalized white supremacy movement, and a political atmosphere charged with intolerance, condemnation, and widespread falsehoods, this book could not be timelier. We are in another era marked by fear and demagoguery, one in which the language of the Red Scare needs only to be modified slightly to fit today's perceived threats. Now, there's a danger when you're writing history, you're really writing contemporary affairs, and one can go overboard seeing parallels that maybe are exaggerated. But would you like to comment on your comments?
Well, as I take this book around, people say, how were you so prescient about what was going to happen today? And the truth is that I started the book in earnest in year 2 of the first Obama term. So what was happening today was as far from my mind as it could be. And a friend of mine is saying that it doesn't take much to lift up the rock and see what crawls out. Those forces are always ready to crawl out. And I see if somebody in the future is writing a book about the Trump era, they're not going to start in 2016. Because those seeds have gone way back. So we see the lessons of Roy Cohn that Donald Trump has internalized. Never apologize, double down, insult your opponents, give them demeaning names. And it's just a kind of a mind bender to hear Trump talk about to attack the Mueller investigation as a witch hunt. If you look up McCarthyism in the dictionary, it will say using demagogic tactics to demean opponents. It's a totally negative connotation. So he is smearing his opponents by calling them McCarthyists, but using every weapon in the Red Scare arsenal. So it is very frightening. And as I had forgotten that I wrote that about just changing the terminology to putting the Muslims in there, the Hispanics. Did you belong to an organization that helped refugees? Did you march in this? It could happen.